Well, as one of those things that hasn't changed in the last 8 years, it's good to see some familiar faces in this crowd as well. It is, as Tim said, a bit of a stretch to our thought of reality in our regularity of when we meet to think that it's been so long since we were able to do what felt so natural every 4 years for many, many years along the way. And so we come to a place where we are having to figure out just about everything, what stays the same, what is different, what is going to be the way we always knew it, what has to be a different way, including what do we call it? And you would be amazed at how many people have so many wonderful opinions as to what something should be called. To the point that we actually had to go to the Judicial Council and say, can we call it this? And we can. So it is the officially named Postponed 2020 General Conference meeting in 2024 in Charlotte, North Carolina. Or if you call it what I do on file names, GC Charlotte. Because numbers seem to confuse us these days, and we all have a different opinion as to how often we should meet. And if it really is every year, good luck. Before I get going on the nuts and bolts and details, I want to give you a little bit of my background and why I built this presentation a particular way. Bishop Holston this morning was talking about his son's first car, or at least a car. I'm assuming it was first. My first car was a 1965 Chevy 2. It was two-tone, green, the Chevy green of the 1960s, if anybody remembers those, and brown, the brown of rust that develops on the outside of a car when it's been around too long and not necessarily well cared for. I don't know what I would have thought if I had opened a garage door. We didn't have a garage. To see a beautiful Civic, even minus all of the electric, everything that it had or didn't have. My Chevy 2, you had to push a lever to get the vent to open to let the air in. That's the car I'm talking about. When I got the upgrade, my parents decided, okay, he didn't kill this one and we've got another son, so he has to drive it for a while. I got to move up to a white Chevy Chevette that had been a fleet car. My parents were special when they thought of things to give us. And my dad was frugal, so he figured out how to find anything at an auction. So the thing that they don't tell you when you get your car is they're expensive to keep running every day. And my parents had pretty well done what they could by saying, here are the keys, good luck. And so, like probably many of you, I worked jobs when I was in school, and I had to work jobs starting basically about 6th or 7th grade, which was good because that meant I didn't have to work for free for my grandfather in his grocery store any longer, and I could get at least a minimal amount of salary to put gas in the car. So one of my jobs that I had from about middle school on was working at one of the 2 weekly county newspapers. Now I want you to picture a 12-year-old kid sitting in front of a computer that you had to type basically with 2 fingers because you had to work so hard at it, and it spit everything out on a roll of paper that had holes punched in it that you had to put over onto another machine that as it ran through the tape, how many of you got to do any of that fun stuff with me? All right, very good. That's what I was doing at 12 years old as I was growing into that job, doing writing, proofreading, setting ad text, yes, using beeswax, rolling it onto the screens. And then, if you can't tell, athletics really was not the field. I was the music and academics kid. So I got to take all the photographs at all of the school activities and did all the photos for the athletics department. The editor that I worked with basically was as old school as it gets, and you always knew within the first 2 paragraphs you had to answer the top 5 questions. Who? What? When? Where? Why or how? He was able to give us a little wiggle room on that. So for this one, I picked how, and I'm hoping that collectively we've all figured out the why. If not, I will leave that to the preachers to fill in the blanks. But starting up with our category of who, I want to walk through all of the players that you might encounter while you are covering General Conference. And I have built this primarily as you have never been there. For those of you who have, this will be a good refresher course. Please just give me grace and remind me if I forget something. For those of you who haven't, this should be your snapshot into the people you will encounter. There are the delegates. The delegates come in 3 groups, and I want to hit them one at a time for each of the 3 groups. One of our complications that we are always working through is there was an old tradition in some of our annual conferences, in some of the central conferences, that they elected 4 categories. And so it's always interesting trying to get the election results to fit in the way they have to be in order to fit into our constitutional requirements. But the Constitution requires that number 1 category is the delegates to General Conference. There is an equal number of clergy and lay delegates elected by the annual conferences that are based on an allocation derived from a disciplinary formula. That's a lot of words. It's saying in the discipline, it tells us how many professing members and how many clergy members we count, and then we divide out equally around the world with all the annual conferences and tell them how many delegates they get. This time, there will be 862 voting delegates. That includes 10 Concordat delegates. Concordat churches are churches that we have special relationships with. We send delegates to their annual conferences. They send delegates to our general conference. When they meet every year, we send fewer to those, and so for the churches that we send to, we send 1 clergy and 1 lay person each time. Since they save up and come only once every 4 years, we allow for the Church of Great Britain to have 2 clergy and 2 lay, so our total is 10 of all the concordats from the 4 concordat churches. There are additional delegates that come from the affiliated autonomous and affiliated united churches. They have voice, but they do not have vote. And we do not send reciprocal delegates to their conferences. We can go if invited, but it's not built into the agreements. Category 2. The first category go to general conference and also to jurisdictional conference or to a central conference. Category 2 are the additional people needed in order to build out the full central conference or full jurisdictional conference contingent. For 4 of the U.S. jurisdictions, in order to find out the number of people in Category 2, you simply double the number in Category 1. For those who are in the Western jurisdiction, it works a little differently. The jurisdictional conference is required to have 100 members minimum. The number of general conference delegates allotted in the Western jurisdiction does not meet that minimum. So in order to allot delegates to the jurisdictional conference for the Western jurisdiction, I have to do math again and proportionally assign out an additional number of delegates that is above the double that it would be in the other 4 jurisdictions. For the central conferences, they establish the number as long as that number meets disciplinary minimum requirements. The third category is the reserved delegates to jurisdictional or central conference. Now remember, Category 2, those folks are additional to central or jurisdictional conference. They also, in the order of election, are the reserve delegates to General Conference. The reserve delegates to jurisdictional and central can also serve as reserve delegates to General Conference, but only if we don't have enough of Category 2 available. So it's not so much that it's the rotate in, rotate out. You're really supposed to be seated the whole time. And the only time that reserve delegates are seated is if you're unable to be on the floor. That's the who of the delegates. Now we get to talk about who is it that's going to be working in different roles, bringing leadership. First, there are two officers of the General Conference. The first is the Secretary of the General Conference, who was elected at the previous General Conference. The second person who is an officer of the General Conference is nominated by the Secretary, and that is the coordinator of the calendar. They work with the Committee on Agenda and Calendar to run all of the schedule as it moves forward and moving all the legislation at the appropriate times. In addition to those two people, there are 3 staff persons who work with General Conference. There have been 2 for many years, and just about 6 weeks ago, we were able to add an executive assistant to the Secretary of the General Conference, and I finally have help. Yay! So, Sarah Hotchkiss and Raquel Perez-Malloy have been in the business office for the past few years, and many of you know their names. Kelly McDonald is the new assistant in my office, and you will be hearing her name if you haven't already. In addition to the staff members, we involve a lot of people who have key roles during General Conference, but they don't serve on staff. They have other lives, other jobs, and so we refer to them as our volunteer staff. For the volunteer staff, the first position is petition secretary. That is the person who receives all the petitions, determines whether or not they meet the requirements, and then assigns them a petition number and assigns them to a legislative committee. For this time around, the petition secretary is Abby Parker Herrera. Abby is from the Rio, Texas annual conference. The Daily Christian Advocate editor is a member of the United Methodist Publishing House staff, and that is Brian Sigmund this time around. Director of Worship and Music. Anybody here know who that might be? Raymond Trapp is here with us, and you'll be getting to hear from Raymond tomorrow and the next day. Raymond is our Director of Music and Worship. Yay! Coordinator of Language Services is Don Reasoner. Coordinators of the Pages and the Marshals, Mark and Laura Wharf. Some of you who have been around for a number of years may remember that name. Mark and Laura served as the coordinators in that office 2 sets of leaders ago. They are from the California-Nevada Annual Conference, and Mark is the conference secretary there. One of the realities of the time in which we live is that all of us have experienced loss. We have experienced loss at the general church level, and especially here on our staff. Our previous director of the Pages and Marshals, the coordinator, was David Atkinson, who was a clergy member of the former Memphis Annual Conference. David passed away after a very brief battle with COVID early in the time that we were in the pandemic. And so Mark and Laura will be stepping in and taking that role. We have all experienced death. We've had deaths of other volunteer staff members, other delegates, and even members of the Commission on General Conference. But people still are willing and able and step up when called, and so we thank them for their work. In addition to these, we have work that happens in public relations, and that's provided by staff from Communications. We have members of the Secretarial and Business Office staff, as well as the DCA staff, recorders, transcribers, and Channel B workers. Anybody know what a Channel B is for General Conference? We have one. Channel B people get to sit on the stage with as big a directory as they can go, as fast as they can go, and seat assignments. And every time one of you walks up to a microphone and you start talking, they say your name and your annual conference quietly off into this other microphone. And it's a sidetrack that the transcribers use if they can't figure out who's talking. Let's say you walked up and went, "Hi, my name is for the annual conference." They don't know what you just said. but the Channel B people have looked you up, and somewhere under your name, there's this thing that said, that's who's at the microphone right now. So the Channel B people are extremely important in what we do as we keep the daily proceedings. We have production teams that come from United Methodist Communications and other sources. We have interpretation and translation teams, and as I mentioned earlier, we have pages and marshals. We have another who that you will be dealing with is the group known as the Commission on the General Conference. Are we stuck on our slides? A couple more. Commission on General Conference is coming up. 24 members are nominated by the Council of Bishops and are elected by the General Conference. There is one seat that is allotted to the local host committee, and there are 4 ex officio member seats that are designated by the discipline. One is the Secretary of the General Conference, the Business Manager of the General Conference, the Bishop who is designated by the Council of Bishops, and the Treasurer of the General Conference, who is also the General Secretary of the General Council on Finance and Administration. The Rules Committee has 2 functions at General Conference. One, they propose the changes, and the Commission endorses those and passes them along in a report to any changes to the plan of organization and rules of order. The Rules Committee was given a new job just recently. Recently, I mean like about 8 years ago, but recently in our operations, the Rules Committee becomes the Ethics Committee of General Conference when we go into session. So they have a dual role at General Conference. In addition to the people who officially are making decisions and choices about General Conference, we also have other United Methodist bodies that have particular roles while we are there. The first is the Judicial Council. The Judicial Council may be called upon to rule on any of the decisions that the General Conference makes as to whether they are constitutional or not. They can be asked to review legislation in advance as to whether it would be constitutional if it were passed, and we experienced a lot of that in 2019, and sometimes we have dealt with that in years previous as well. The agencies, the 13 agencies of our church, they bring their general secretaries and they bring their agency staff, and they have many, many, many roles at General Conference. The Council of Bishops is there, and they function as organizers of our committee officer elections. Some of them serve as presidents of agency boards. Some of them are preachers in our worship services, and some preside in plenary sessions of the General Conference. Another group that we have is the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. They are elected by General Conference and are assigned the task of dealing with anything that relates to the Central Conferences during the 4-year interim between the sessions of General Conference. Another body is the Connectional Table that coordinates work of the agencies and figures out mission, ministry, finances along with GCFA and helps us as we articulate the vision of the church. There are annual conference leaders. Some of you will be sending staff people, and other people of your annual conference will be coming along to see what is going on or to take particular roles. Or you have staff members who will be coming. There are members of the United Methodist Association of Communicators that might be there. And another one that I didn't have on my list, but you probably are aware of them as well, is UMITA. UMITA. Some people say it one way, some people say it the other. The United Methodist Information Technology Association. I call them the people who keep the computers running. And they do great work for us in helping out along the way. We also have official guests. There are ecumenical guests that are brought in from the Office of Christian Unity of the Council of Bishops. And also we have religious and secular press members. There are media credentials that are issued by General Conference and are coordinated upon recommendation of United Methodist Communications staff. You will be hearing more about that a little bit later in the week. And those credentials allow access to the press room. Shall I tell them now? Sure. Okay. We're going to give you a preview into what you're going to hear when Tim brings another section of his presentation. But there's going to be a section specifically for UMAC members. I'll let him fill in all the blanks. I'm just letting you know we've done a little dreaming and a little drawing and a little planning, and we're going to try to help out as best we can. There are also, in addition to all of these other participants, people who like to watch. And so they sit around in wherever those seats are provided, in whatever kinds of seats are provided, and they watch everything that you do. We call them the observers. And so the observers are an important part of General Conference as well. In the WHO, the seat that I named on the Commission on General Conference for the local host committee, that local host effort in a normal quadrennium, whatever that used to be, we would know where we were going to the next city at least 8 years in advance. Yeah, we don't have the ability to do that right now because we don't actually technically know when we're meeting next. And you can't sign a contract that says whenever they tell us. The people don't do that. So we're in a little bit of a different situation, and it impacts our local support dramatically. Normally, a local host committee has had 6 years at least to do fundraising, planning, recruiting of volunteers, to do all of the work that is required of them. This time, we are being hosted by the Western North Carolina Annual Conference. All right. Because that's where Charlotte is. But it is not fair to an annual conference to say good luck when there's a neighbor right next door that can help out. So we went to the North Carolina Annual Conference, and we asked them if they would consider coming along and being partners together. And so we're being hosted by the United Methodists of North Carolina. Bishop Ken Carter and Mrs. Wanda Musgrave are leading the efforts in the Western North Carolina Annual Conference, while Bishop Connie Shelton and Reverend Trish Archer are doing so in the North Carolina Annual Conference. So working together as a team, they are sharing one seat on the Commission on General Conference. We do a little musical chairs every now and then, just to make sure that everything can happen along the way. But now we've done the who, and it's time to move to the what. On the what are we doing there? Why are we getting together? What is the purpose? What is happening? We hit worship. And in the worship services, I've listed out some of the more special moments that happen in our worship times. The consecration of home missioners and deaconesses, the ecumenical service and Methodist family welcome, the commissioning of missionaries, Thursdays in Black, Episcopal, laity, and young people's addresses. And in case you didn't make all the connections, every one of those is attached to one of our agencies. They are supporting all of those efforts along the way. In addition to worship, there is the expectation that we are there for Christian conferencing. And if you want to learn more about Christian conferencing, you can look in the Plan of Organization and Rules of Order, because the preamble talks all about Christian conferencing, and these rules help us to do that. This organization helps us to do that. We are also there to do the required elections of people who will serve in various roles for the upcoming quadrennium, and as you will read over and over and over again, the General Conference has primary legislative responsibility. In addition to the what of what we will be doing, it's the what of what will it look like and what will it be called that I started out with. So we're going to give you a new look at the updated theme and logo. The theme stayed the same. Because according to Judicial Council decision, this is the postponed 2020 General Conference, and everything that can simply moves forward. So the theme is remaining the same, and know that I am God. We will be using various things to put in front of the ellipse, not just simply be still. There will be all kinds of things that you can do to know that God is God. If you will also notice, there's not a date on this, and the word postponed is not all over it. Those were two little changes we made, but really the primary piece was you can't have a logo for one city while meeting in another city. So we had to lift out the Minneapolis, Minnesota skyline and insert the Charlotte, North Carolina skyline, thanks to our friends at UMCOM who do all of our logo work. So, great job. On the how, we have 3 basic steps that happen with anything that's coming to the General Conference. First, we have to figure out who it is that's going to do the work, so we allocate and elect the delegates. Then people send us petitions. So we have the submission and the deliberation of and any decisions on the petitions that have been submitted. And the final step is the implementation of approved legislation and other decisions of the General Conference. So who is it, what are they going to do, and what do we do with it? That's really the 3 basic steps. So while you are at General Conference, this is the legislative process. For those of you who grew up watching Schoolhouse Rock, this is the church version in the United Methodist Church. Our legislative process, submission of petitions, and in this case, the petitions that were originally submitted and met the first deadline for 2020 and are already printed in the ADCA that has already been distributed. They are all still there. Then by judicial council decision, anytime there is a postponement, we reset the clock and we open a window and people start sending. So when we knew the announced date of 2024, we had the 230-day count back, and that was September the 6th. So that was the deadline for any individuals or groups to send petitions. They are currently being processed by the petition secretary, and for the first time in 24 years, that is not happening in my dining room. That is in Abby's living room right now. So Abby gets to keep doing that work and will let us know as soon as the petitions are ready to move to the ADCA supplemental version. The supplemental version is going to be a digital version and will be given to the delegates upon their arrival in Charlotte, because those of you who work in printing know the printing deadlines are way, way, way extended. And for those of you who work in shipping, there is not a chance that we would get these to every corner of the world they have to go to. We barely got most of them out for 2020. Some of them, we still don't know where they are. Thank you to our wonderful people who make deliveries every day, but they're having trouble keeping up right now. And so we're not going to try to ship those. We will be issuing them, but they will be available online ahead of time, and will meet the disciplinary requirement on that. So those petitions come in. They are either disciplinary, which also includes the constitutional amendments. They are resolutions that would be contained in the Book of Resolutions or affect the Book of Resolutions. And we're in that weird moment because we didn't meet, that we have a rule that says every petition has an 8-year life, and then it has to be renewed or replaced or something. So basically, if you own a Book of Resolutions, that whole thing is up for us to be able to look at this time around, or else they sunset and go away. So non-disciplinary petitions are any petitions that don't relate to either of those books, but it's a decision the General Conference has made and we implement. Those are prepared and the ADCA is distributed. It tells us the petitions that have been assigned to legislative committees. It gives us the reports from the agencies. It talks about delegate lists, if those delegate lists were in time to meet the printing deadline. So that was the issue 2020. Now we've had a lot of other changes for other reasons, and so there will be an updated delegate list that will be included in the supplement. The digital ADCA and the supplemental ADCA will be coming. It also gives information about the venue. It really doesn't help us to have a handbook for delegates in 2020 that tell them where the restaurants in Minneapolis are when they're going to be trying to eat in Charlotte. So it doesn't help them to know where the ballroom is in the Minneapolis Convention Center when we're going to be in another convention center in another state. So we have to do a reprint of all the basic information that needs to be provided, including the schedule. What will we do every day? The next step in the legislative process after the receipt of the ADCA is that the petitions are reviewed by the Advanced Legislative Research Panel. They are then assigned to the legislative committees that meet, elect, and train their officers. There is consideration of the petitions by the subcommittees or the committee first, depending upon the size of the committee. And the report of the recommendation that committee has on the petition when it sends it either on to the consent calendar or it sends it to the committee on agenda and calendar to be added to the daily plenary calendar. The plenary action is taken, voting is on electronic voting devices, and we decide whether or not that petition moves forward. If the plenary approves it, that material is reviewed by the Secretary of the General Conference, by the book editor of the United Methodist Publishing House, and by one of our administrative committees, the only one that is made up of people who are not delegates. It's the Committee on Correlation and Editorial Revision. They look to see if there are any conflicts. Did anything get passed that's in conflict with something that's already there? Did two things get passed that don't say the same thing? Which one of them is the one that gets into the Book of Discipline? And there's actually a rule in the discipline about that. It's the one that passes closest to the final adjournment. So whichever our last action on a matter is, that's the one that prevails. If all of that is handled and everything is found to be in order, those approved items go into the Book of Discipline, the Book of Resolutions. They get referred or distributed wherever the motion might have said, or they get sent out to the annual conferences to be voted on if they are a proposed constitutional amendment. There will be some of those. You will get to report on those because you vote on them at your annual conferences the following year. So if we pass it, you get notification through your annual conference secretary that this is a ballot that you will need to take. The problem is we have to calculate that as they are all returned. So one of the things that you more than likely will be asked is to not give the vote tallies at your annual conference because whoever's sitting at home doing math figures it all out when we don't even have them all in. And then everybody's on whatever is X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it now, that they're telling what it is, and that affects the impact for those annual conferences that don't even meet for 4 more months, but they can see trending. So we try not to project that out. That is the reason that that request is made of you. The legislative committees, I mentioned them. There are 14 of them this time around. Church and Society, 1, 2, and 3. There used to be 1 and 2. We needed a 3, so now we have 3 of those. Conferences, there's a lot of stuff going to be happening in conferences. You might want to put your eyeballs there. Discipleship, Faith and Order, Financial Administration, General Administration, Global Ministries, Higher Education and Superintendency, Independent Commissions, Judicial Administration, Local Church, and Ordained Ministry. In addition to those 14, the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters serves a legislative role at General Conference in reviewing the material that relates to the Central Conferences and moving that directly to the plenary. In addition to those committees, we have administrative committees, the Agenda and Calendar Committee. That's the one that figures out what we're doing the next day, figures out what we're going to be doing all during this day, and then looking ahead. Correlation and editorial revision, I've already mentioned. Courtesies and privileges, it works a lot like the one at annual conference. If you want to send greetings or do anything that's a matter of personal privilege, it goes through them. The Committee on Credentials, if there's a challenge or a question about the seating of a delegate, the Credentials Committee advises the Secretary of the General Conference on steps to be taken and makes recommendations to the full body. The Committee on Journal, They review the daily proceedings. The Committee on Presiding Officers select the officers from the Council of Bishops who will be presiding at each of the sessions. And the Committee on Reference that handles whether petitions have been entered properly, whether they've been assigned to the proper legislative committee, anything else that deals with matters that are going to be voted on by the General Conference. I also mentioned the Advanced Legislative Research Panel, the Committee on Ethics, and the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters previously. We wanted to go through the steps that occur in the registration and credentials process because all of your folks will be going through that step. Those delegates that I started with in category 1, 2, or 3 at the beginning, this is focused primarily on the category 1. Certificate of election is submitted by the annual conference secretary. It is reviewed and approved, or it is sent back for correction, and once it meets approval, it finally would move forward. Once that happens, credential cards are created and issued to the annual conference secretary. They will have my signature on them, and each annual conference secretary is to sign the credentials. Then they hand them to the delegates individually, and the delegate comes into the registration area with their credential card and their government-issued photo ID that they have already submitted and is in the record. Whether that is a driver's license, a state-issued ID card, a military record, or a passport. We have asked for those copies in advance, and what they show us has to match what we have on file. We are doing this to be as careful as we can in the credentialing of each person and verifying their identity. They enter with that credential card and that ID. They will go through individual registration. We will not have a group of 12 people all walk up and try to go through at the same time. And if there are people who do not speak English, the interpretation will be provided by our staff members, not someone in the delegation who just chooses to speak for everyone. So we will make sure that we are providing those interpreters. There will be photos on the name tags, and we will involve the Committee on Credentials if that becomes necessary at any point. There will be orientations, 2 of them primarily. There will be one for delegates from annual conferences and the central conferences. That is being done in advance. It is about a 2.5-day training that we will be doing with them that will be on site. In addition to that, we will be doing an orientation of all delegates on Tuesday morning prior to lunch. For those of you who were in St. Louis for 2019 or were following along online, it's basically that block that we did at the end of the day of prayer before we started in plenary the next morning, so that we give as much basic instruction, we test the voting devices, we walk through all of the basics that people will need. There is a head of delegation meeting that occurs prior to that, and so they will also have had training in that in advance. If you are interested in the where, I think we've kind of already given a little glimpse of that, but here's one of the entrances to the Charlotte Convention Center. This is the door on the Martin Luther King Boulevard side, if I'm not mistaken. So that is our entrance into Charlotte. Right across the corner from that is the Hilton and the stop for the Blue Line. And so if you are going down the Blue Line to one of the two stations that have hotels nearby, all of our hotels are walkable, but there is a rapid transit light rail that could assist with that if necessary. Your hotel rooms for your delegates are being assigned through the General Conference office, as well as their airline tickets will be provided that way as well. For those of you who are members of UMAC and are coming into the UMAC block, Roy is waving at me from the hallway because she's going to handle with Sarah the housing for the UMAC block, which we've increased because we didn't think that the number we were given was quite enough for all of you. So we're providing a few extras, and as soon as those are assigned, you will know where you'll be staying. If you would like to, for those of you who are with delegations or agencies, any contact for that is through Sarah Hotchkiss, the business manager on the hotels. There is a floor plan available on the Charlotte Convention Center website. If you would like to just see what the rooms all look like and laid out, you're able to do that. But I will tell you, there is a food court. There is a Starbucks. Their Starbucks, about a month and a half ago, started doing the mobile order in advance, and they can have it ready for you when you walk up. Unless there are 30 other people who did that and you're all standing there in a cluster waiting to hear your name called out. But you still can go ahead and order it in advance, which means you can tell them exactly how many shots and foams and twists that you want in there, and you don't have to remember it and tell it every time. You can just have that in your phone. And the convention center is attached to the NASCAR Hall of Fame. It is not monster trucks with dirt, but we got as close as we could. If you don't understand that joke, see a friend who went to St. Louis. The convention center also has a train that runs through it. It really does. You did not know that? There is a train that runs through the convention center. You cannot go from the east side meeting rooms to the west side meeting rooms without going under the train track. So you either do it through the lobby or through a hallway on the other end if you're looking at the floor plans that are available on their website. East to west, train track, right smack dab through the building. That will be very entertaining at some points, I'm sure. I was amazed at the engineering of how you could have a train run through a building and you don't really hear it when you're in the building. So, it's pretty cool. We've done all of the questions except when. I don't think it's too soon, is it? It's been almost 7 years in this job to do something I was going to do 4 years ago. 2020? No. 21? No. 22? No. 24? Yes. I don't care what, the answer is yes. April 23rd through May the 3rd of 2024, we will be gathering. I do want to end my remarks with one simple phrase. Thank you. Thank you for telling our stories. Whether it's through the DCA, through the news service, through the annual conference sources and outlets that you have, through the secular press, through whatever format you have, thank you for telling our stories. You have heard other speakers already talk about being inspiring, being encouraging, giving the human face to a rather dull business process that we go through in some people's minds. And it's so much more than that for us. And the way they know that it is so much more is through the stories that you tell. I've been doing this since 1992 in some form or fashion. Yes, I started when I was 6. I tried, at least. The stories I remember are the stories about the identical twins who are serving as delegates for the last 4 years, or the 7 generations of people who've been coming from the same church to be delegates at General Conference, or all kinds of things that you find to tell us the stories of the people who are around us. Give us the human interest. Give us their backgrounds. Give us those inspiring and encouraging stories. Thank you for the ongoing support and partnership with UMAC and UMCOM as the messengers of our particular denomination and our story, continuing to focus on who we are and who we will be. And thank you for your continued personal persistence in doing what you are called to do, even when it is not easy, when it is not simple, or when it feels like no one is listening, including the people you advise or your audience. Thank you for still doing it. because people are listening. They are watching, whether it feels like it or not. Thank you for all you do.